Dr. Amara Nkosi adjusted her designer sunglasses as the afternoon sun streamed through the terminal windows of New York's JFK Airport. At 34, she was already a powerhouse, founder and CEO of Nkosi Capital, a venture firm with billions in assets, and a frequent face on Forbes' most influential women in tech lists. Today, she was heading to San Francisco to finalize a landmark deal that would funnel $500 million into sustainable AI startups. Dressed in an immaculate cream blazer and tailored slacks, her presence commanded attention, but as she stepped onto the plane, she noticed the flight attendant's eyes narrow. "Ma'am, this is first class," the woman said, her tone dripping with skepticism. Amara, accustomed to these microaggressions, simply smiled and handed over her boarding pass. "Yes, I know," she replied smoothly. The attendant scanned it, her lips pursed, before reluctantly allowing her to proceed. Amara found her seat, 1A, and settled in, pulling out her laptop to review last-minute notes. But then, the attendant returned with a manager. "We need to verify your ticket again," the man said, his voice firm. Amara's patience thinned. "I've already shown it," she said, holding up her phone with the digital boarding pass. The manager's eyes flickered with something she recognized too well, doubt. "We've had reports of fraudulent upgrades," he said, though no one else in the cabin was being questioned. A nearby passenger, a white man in his 50s, leaned over. "Is there a problem?" he asked, as if assuming authority. The manager hesitated, then radioed security. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived. "You need to come with us," one said. Amara's stomach dropped. "On what grounds?" she demanded. "We've received a complaint about disruptive behavior," the officer replied, though she had done nothing but sit quietly. When she refused to move without explanation, they grabbed her arms, yanking her from her seat. Her laptop clattered to the floor. "Let go of me," she shouted, but they dragged her down the aisle as passengers gasped. One woman pulled out her phone, recording. Amara's heart pounded, not just from humiliation, but fury. She knew this wasn't just about a ticket. It was about the color of her skin, the assumption that a black woman couldn't possibly belong in first class. As they hauled her into the jet bridge, she twisted to face the officer. "You're making a mistake," she seethed. "Do you know who I am?" The officer shrugged. "Doesn't matter. You're off this flight." Back in the terminal, shaking with adrenaline, Amara called her lawyer, then her COO. "Cancel all our meetings," she said, her voice steely. "We're going to war." By the time she boarded another airline's flight hours later, the video of her removal had already racked up 1 million views. The caption, "Billionaire investor dragged off plane in racist profiling incident." The storm was coming, and Amara wasn't just going to weather it. She was going to unleash it. The moment Amara's plane touched down in San Francisco, her phone exploded with notifications, thousands of retweets, mentions, and media requests. The video of her forcible removal had spread like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of outrage. By the time she reached her penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, #BoycottSkyGlobal was trending worldwide, and major news outlets were dissecting the incident frame by frame. CNN played the clip on loop, with anchors debating whether this was an isolated case or part of a systemic pattern of discrimination in air travel. Prominent figures, celebrities, politicians, civil rights leaders, weighed in, their collective fury amplifying the story. Beyoncé's publicist released a statement condemning the airline's blatant racial profiling, while Senator Kamala Harris called for a congressional hearing on passenger rights. But Amara wasn't interested in performative allyship. She wanted action. As she scrolled through the tidal wave of support, her COO, Marcus, burst into the room, laptop in hand. "Sky Global's stock just dropped 3% in after-hours trading," he said, barely containing his excitement. Amara smirked. "Good, but we're just getting started." She pulled up Sky Global's investor portfolio on her tablet. Nkosi Capital held a $2 billion in market cap. The financial press went into a frenzy. "Billionaire investor exacts revenge after airline humiliation," blared Bloomberg, while the Wall Street Journal speculated about a hostile takeover. Meanwhile, Sky Global's PR team scrambled, releasing a tepid apology that only fueled the backlash. "We regret any inconvenience caused and are reviewing our policies." The statement read, as if Amar's ordeal was a minor customer service hiccup. She fired back on Twitter. "Inconvenience? Try assault. Try humiliation. Try racism. Your review is worthless without accountability." The tweet went viral within minutes, racking up 500,000 likes. Behind the scenes, her legal team was already preparing a lawsuit, but Amara had a bigger play in mind. She called an emergency board meeting where she laid out her plan. "We're not just suing them, we're dismantling them." By dawn, news broke that 3 major pension funds, all Nkosi Capital Partners, had joined to sell off, triggering a full-blown investor revolt. Sky Global CEO Robert Langford was reportedly on a frantic conference call with shareholders, his tone shifting from dismissive to desperate. Amara, sipping her espresso, watched the chaos unfold with cold satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about sending a message to every corporation that thought they could dehumanize black customers without consequence. And she was far from done. The opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange echoed like a death knell for Sky Global as trading began in a storm of panic. Overnight, the airline stock had collapsed under the weight of Amar's million torpedo that shattered the buyback's momentum. The impact was instant. Credit rating agencies downgraded Sky Global's bonds to junk status, and leasing companies began recalling aircraft, fearing the airline might default on payments. Across the Atlantic, Airbus executives emergency called Langford, threatening to cancel Sky Global's $3 billion order for new jets. The dominoes kept falling. By noon, airport unions joined the fray, staging walkouts at major hubs with signs reading "Racism doesn't fly." Travel influencers with millions of followers posted videos shredding their Sky Global loyalty cards. And then, the coup de grace. Bloomberg leaked that Amara was in talks with rival airline JetFury to back a hostile takeover. Langford's face, pallid and sweating, flashed across financial networks as he stammered through a press conference, promising a full, independent review. But the market had already rendered its verdict. Sky Global was now a carcass, picked apart by vultures. Amara leaned back in her chair, watching the ticker symbols bleed out. This wasn't just a financial maneuver, it was a reckoning. And as her phone lit up with calls from Washington and Wall Street, she knew the real battle was just beginning. The collapse of Sky Global stock was only the beginning. The real reckoning unfolded in the hushed corridors of power, where corporate titans and politicians scrambled to contain the fallout. By the third day of the crisis, the airline's board had convened an emergency meeting, their faces grim under the sterile glow of the conference room's LED lights. Robert Langford, his once impeccable suit now rumpled from sleepless nights, stood before them, his voice hoarse as he recited prepared remarks about rebuilding trust. But the directors weren't listening. One by one, they turned on him, their loyalty evaporating faster than shareholder value. "You've turned us into a pariah," hissed Margaret Cho, the lead independent director, her manicured nails tapping a furious rhythm on the table. "This isn't just a PR disaster, it's existential." The vote was unanimous. Langford was out, effective immediately, his golden parachute slashed to ribbons by a clause tying his severance to stock performance. His replacement, interim CEO Daniela Reyes, was a crisis management specialist known for salvaging toxic brands, but even she paled when she saw the full scope of the damage. The FAA had launched an investigation into Sky Global's passenger removal policies. The Justice Department was subpoenaing internal communications, and Amara's legal team had filed a blistering $100 million venture to invest in minority-owned aviation startups. "If the industry won't change," she declared at a packed press conference, "we'll build a new one." The symbolism was brutal. Sky Global, once a titan of the skies, was now a cautionary tale, its name synonymous with bigotry and failure. As the week closed, Daniela Reyes made a desperate public plea for reconciliation, offering Amara a board seat and a promise of systemic reform. But Amara's response was a single, icy tweet. "Too late for apologies. The future belongs to those who build it." The markets heard her loud and clear. JetFury's stock soared as Sky Global's debt was downgraded again. The reckoning wasn't just corporate, it was cultural. And it was far from over. 12 months after the incident that sparked a revolution, the aviation industry bore little resemblance to its former self. Sky Global, once a dominant force in air travel, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, its stock price languishing at a fraction of its peak, its reputation in tatters, its leadership team replaced by a diversity-focused executive board scrambling to implement the sweeping reforms demanded by activists and investors alike. Meanwhile, Amara Nkosi stood on the tarmac of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, watching as the inaugural flight of Ubuntu Airways, the first black-owned luxury airline, prepared for takeoff. The gleaming Airbus A350, its tail emblazoned with the striking adinkra symbol meaning justice, was more than just a plane. It was a statement, a physical manifestation of the change she had fought for. The launch had drawn global media attention, with cameras capturing every detail of the celebration, the all-black pilot crew posing proudly in tailored uniforms, the investors and entrepreneurs who had backed the venture, many of them beneficiaries of Amara's $100 million equity fund, and the activists who had fought for years to hold airlines accountable. As Amara stepped to the podium, the crowd fell silent. "This isn't just about luxury," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's about dignity. It's about proving that exclusion has a cost, and that inclusion has immeasurable value." The applause was thunderous. Later, aboard the maiden flight to Johannesburg, a symbolic nod to her South African heritage, Amara sipped champagne as passengers marveled at the airline's innovations, AI-powered translation for non-English speakers, bias-trained cabin crew, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination enforced by an independent oversight board. The industry took note. Within weeks, 3 major carriers announced similar initiatives, desperate to avoid Sky Global's fate. Back in Washington, legislation dubbed the Nkosi Act, mandating strict anti-discrimination protocols across all U.S. airlines, cleared the Senate with bipartisan support. Even former adversaries sought her counsel. The ousted Sky Global CEO, Robert Langford, now a cautionary tale in MBA programs, had reportedly reached out through intermediaries, begging for a meeting. Amara declined. She had moved beyond retribution. Now she was building. As Ubuntu Airways stock soared on its first day of trading, she sat in her office, scrolling through photos of that infamous day at JFK. The humiliation still burned, but the fire had forged something far greater. Her phone buzzed, another interview request, this time from 60 Minutes. She smiled. The world was listening, and she was just getting started. The success of Ubuntu Airways sent shockwaves through the global aviation industry, but for Amara Nkosi, this was merely the first domino to fall in her grander vision of systemic change. 6 months after the airline's triumphant launch, she stood before the United Nations General Assembly, not as a victim of racial injustice, but as architect of a new economic paradigm where corporate accountability and social justice were inextricably linked. The invitation had come after Ubuntu Airways' revolutionary business model, prioritizing equitable hiring practices, cultural competency training at every level, and profit sharing with marginalized communities, was adopted by 12 international carriers under pressure from both consumers and governments. Even more telling was the financial performance. Ubuntu's stock had outperformed legacy airlines by 300%, proving that ethical business wasn't just morally defensible but financially superior. Yet Amara's ambitions stretched beyond aviation. With Nkosi Equity Flight Fund now oversubscribed at $250 million, she announced the Ubuntu Consortium, a coalition of Black and minority-led venture capital firms pooling resources to target industries notorious for systemic bias: banking, healthcare, and tech. Their first move? A hostile stake in the very credit card company whose loyalty points had propped up Sky Global's frequent flyer program, forcing it to overhaul its algorithms after data proved they systematically undervalued purchases in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the cultural shift became undeniable. Ivy League business schools scrambled to add case studies on the Nkosi effect, while corporate boards, fearful of becoming the next cautionary tale, diversified at unprecedented rates. The backlash from traditional power brokers was fierce but futile. A cohort of aging billionaire investors filed a joint op-ed in the Wall Street Journal decrying woke capital, only to watch their own portfolios bleed value as Gen Z and millennial investors abandoned them en masse. Even political landscapes shifted. The Nkosi Act's success spawned similar legislation in the EU and UK, while a grassroots movement to Nkosi-proof corporations went viral, with employees auditing their company's practices and leaking disparities to the press. Yet amid the maelstrom, Amara remained focused on her North Star, leverage. When a consortium of Silicon Valley titans invited her to keynote their annual retreat, she used the platform to unveil Project Sankofa, an AI-driven platform to track corporate diversity metrics in real time, with public rankings that would directly impact credit ratings. The room, filled with CEOs who'd once dismissed DI as a PR checkbox, erupted in uneasy applause. As she left the stage, her phone buzzed, a message from the White House Chief of Staff. "The president wants to discuss a cabinet position. When can you come to D.C.?" Amara exhaled, watching the sunset over the Pacific. Power, she'd learned, wasn't just about wealth or influence. It was about redesigning the game, so the rules themselves demanded justice. And for the first time since that humiliating day at JFK, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The world was bending, and she was far from finished. The world had underestimated Amara Nkosi once, a mistake it would not repeat. But as her influence expanded across industries and borders, the forces arrayed against her began to coalesce in ways even she hadn't anticipated. It started with whispers, anonymous op-eds in financial journals questioning Ubuntu Airways safety standards, coordinated social media campaigns accusing Project Sankofa of reverse discrimination, and a sudden flurry of lawsuits from conservative groups challenging the Nkosi Act's constitutionality. Then came the bombshell. A hacked email leak, selectively edited to make it appear Amara had conspired with foreign investors to manipulate stock prices. Fox News ran the story with the cheering billionaire activist's dirty war for 18 consecutive hours. The timing was suspiciously precise, just as Amara's team was finalizing a landmark deal to acquire a controlling stake in Boston's largest hospital network, aiming to dismantle healthcare disparities. Overnight, the narrative shifted. Congressional Republicans launched an investigation into her anti-business agenda, subpoenaing years of Nkosi Capital's records. Old allies in the Biden administration grew cautious, delaying the cabinet offer indefinitely. Even more troubling were the threats. A break-in at Ubuntu Airways headquarters, dismissed by police as vandalism despite stolen hard drives. A bullet mailed to her D.C. office with a note, "Know your place." The most vicious blow came from an unexpected quarter. Sky Global's new CEO, a former Pentagon official, held a press conference flanked by uniformed pilots to announce a lawsuit accusing Ubuntu of industrial espionage. The media circus that followed was masterfully orchestrated. Every news cycle now carried some new revelation about Amara's radical network. Yet for all the coordinated opposition, they'd made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed she'd play defense. On a rainy Thursday morning, Amara walked into the New York Stock Exchange wearing the same cream blazer from the day of her removal. Live on CNBC, she announced two moves that sent shockwaves through the establishment. First, Nkosi Capital was taking private equity giant Blackmore and Co. hostile, targeting their $12 billion stake in private prisons. Second, she'd partnered with WikiLeaks to release unredacted documents proving Sky Global's board had systematically bribed regulators for years. The counterattack was nuclear. Blackmore's stock cratered 40% in 3 hours, triggering margin calls that collapsed 2 hedge funds. The DOJ indicted 3 Sky Global executives by sundown. And in a move that stunned pundits, the Service Employees International Union endorsed Amara's hospital takeover, bringing 2 million healthcare workers into her coalition. That night, as her security detail swept her penthouse for bugs, Amara stared at the skyline, adrenaline still humming in her veins. They wanted war? Fine. But she wrote the rules now. And this time, she'd burn the whole system down before going back to the back of the plane. The walls were closing in, but not on Amara. As the smear campaign against her reached a fever pitch, her team made a discovery that would change everything. a trail of encrypted payments linking Sky Global's lawsuit to a network of dark money groups funded by none other than Richard Kessler, the billionaire media mogul whose empire had been attacking her relentlessly. The revelation came not from corporate espionage, but from an unlikely ally, a whistleblower inside Kessler's own organization, a junior analyst who had grown disillusioned with the machine's ruthlessness. The documents she smuggled out were damning. Detailed memos outlining Operation Blackout, coordinated effort to discredit and destabilize Nkosi's influence through legal, media, and financial pressure. Amara's legal team moved swiftly, filing a RICO lawsuit that named Kessler, Sky Global's board, and 3 U.S. senators as co-conspirators in a criminal enterprise to suppress civil rights progress under the guise of free market protection. The lawsuit's release was timed to the minute, just as Kessler's flagship news channel was airing another segment painting Amara as a radical socialist. The fallout was immediate and seismic. The DOJ, already reeling from Amara's earlier leaks, launched a task force to investigate the allegations. 2 of the implicated senators hastily retired, citing health reasons. And in a moment that would be replayed across social media for weeks, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez brandished the Operation Blackout documents during a House hearing, her voice shaking with fury. This isn't just corruption, it's a conspiracy against racial justice. But the true turning point came when Amara took the stage at the National Action Network's annual convention. For the first time, she spoke not as a CEO or philanthropist, but as a woman who had been pushed too far. "They think this is about money or power," she said, the crowd hanging on every word. "But I've had both. This is about what they did when they thought no one was watching." Then she unveiled her masterstroke, Project Lighthouse, a real-time database tracking corporate lobbying against diversity initiatives, with every donation, every backroom deal, every politician bought and paid for, all searchable by the public. The site crashed within minutes from a flood of traffic. By week's end, the dominoes fell faster than anyone could track. Kessler resigned from his own company amid shareholder revolts. Sky Global settled the espionage lawsuit for a record $900 million, which Amara immediately funneled into HBCU STEM programs. Most poetic of all, the FBI raided the private prison firm Blackmore had invested in, arresting its CEO for bribery, on evidence Amara's team had quietly handed prosecutors months earlier. As she watched Kessler's perp walk on live TV, Amara allowed herself one quiet moment of satisfaction. They tried to bury her. Instead, she'd exposed the whole rotten system, and the world would never be the same. The world held its breath as Amara Nkosi stepped onto the TED stage, the same woman who had been dragged off a plane now standing beneath a banner that read simply, "How to burn down a broken system and build something better." For 18 minutes, without notes or teleprompter, she laid out a vision so radical it silenced even her critics. The Phoenix Agenda called for nothing less than the complete dismantling of shareholder primacy, the doctrine that had driven corporate America for a century. In its place, she proposed a new metric, stakeholder justice, where companies would be legally evaluated not just on profits, but on pay equity, supplier diversity, and community impact. "Capitalism isn't the problem," she declared, her voice echoing across the internet as live streams surged into the millions. "Unaccountable power is, and today we're taking it back." The speech went supernova, but what happened next rewrote history. Within hours, California's pension fund, the largest in the U.S., announced it would divest from any company failing Amara's new audit standards. The NYSE and NASDAQ followed with plans to launch justice-adjusted stock indices. Even BlackRock, the world's most powerful asset manager, scrambled to rebrand its ESG funds under her framework. Yet the true earthquake came from an unexpected quarter. 27,000 Amazon warehouse workers walked off the job, demanding their employer adopt the Phoenix metrics, and they'd brought receipts. Leaked documents proved the company had known for years that injury rates spiked 300% in majority black facilities. The strike spread to ports, factories, and even Wall Street itself, where junior analysts leaked damning emails about racialized bonus disparities. The movement now had a name, Phoenix Rising, and its emblem, a stylized flame, appeared everywhere from protest signs to the lapels of progressive Congress members. Amara, meanwhile, was already 3 steps ahead. Her team quietly activated Operation Icarus, a network of activist investors prepared to simultaneously file shareholder resolutions at 50 Fortune 500 companies, demanding full Phoenix compliance. The play was as brilliant as it was ruthless. By weaponizing the very capitalist tools that had oppressed marginalized communities, she turned the system against itself. Banks that had redlined neighborhoods now faced depositor revolts. Tech giants found their own algorithms turned against them as #PhoenixAudit exposed bias in everything from hiring software to mortgage approvals. Then, at the movement's peak, came the ultimate validation. The White House invited her to draft an executive order mandating stakeholder justice metrics for all federal contractors. As Marine One touched down to whisk her to Washington, Amara allowed herself one fleeting thought looking at the presidential seal. They dragged me off a plane for wearing cream slacks. Now they're flying me to remake the economy. The irony wasn't lost on her, nor was the symbolism. Some fires didn't destroy. They purified. 5 years after the incident that sparked a revolution, the world had transformed in ways few could have imagined. Amara Nkosi stood on the balcony of her Johannesburg estate, overlooking the city where Ubuntu Airways now headquartered its global operations, its fleet having tripled in size to meet unprecedented demand. The airline wasn't just profitable. It had become a case study in ethical capitalism, its success proving that equity and excellence weren't mutually exclusive. Below her, preparations were underway for the first Phoenix Summit, a gathering of the world's most influential CEOs, policymakers, and grassroots organizers, all there to sign the new Global Compact, a binding agreement to adopt stakeholder justice as the baseline for international business. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same power brokers who'd once dismissed her as a woke activist now clamored for her endorsement, their companies reshaped by the very reforms they'd fought against. But the true measure of change lay beyond boardrooms. In the U.S., the Nkosi Doctrine had been codified into law, requiring public companies to meet strict diversity and equity benchmarks. Europe had followed suit, and even China, though resistant to her rhetoric, had quietly implemented its own version of Project Sankofa's audit system after realizing the economic cost of exclusion. The financial impact was staggering. Economies that embraced the Phoenix metrics grew faster, with narrower wealth gaps and higher innovation rates. Meanwhile, Sky Global existed only as a cautionary tale in business textbooks, its assets long absorbed by competitors who'd learned the hard way that discrimination was bad for the bottom line. Yet for all the systemic victories, Amara's most personal triumph came that morning, when her 7-year-old niece FaceTimed her from first class on a Ubuntu flight to London. "Auntie, pilot said I can visit the cockpit." The girl squealed, her braids bouncing as she held up a model plane, a gift from the all-black female crew. Amara's breath caught. This was why she'd fought, so the next generation would never know the humiliation she'd endured, so they'd board planes, apply for jobs, and dream big without first bracing for the sting of exclusion. As the summit's opening gavel sounded, Amara adjusted the Kent cloth stole over her tailored suit, a nod to heritage she now wore unapologetically. The road ahead wasn't perfect. Backlash still simmered in pockets of entrenched power, and complacency was the enemy of progress. But as she stepped to the podium to roaring applause, she offered the world a smile that held both fire and forgiveness. "They told us changing the system was impossible," she began, her voice steady. "Look how wrong they were." The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. History, it turned out, wasn't written by the powerful. It was written by those who refused to accept their place in the old story. And Amara Nkosi had just penned the first lines of the new one. The world held its breath as Amara Nkosi stepped onto the TED stage, the same woman who had been dragged off a plane now standing beneath a banner that read simply, "How to burn down a broken system and build something better." For 18 minutes, without notes or teleprompter, she laid out a vision so radical it silenced even her critics. The Phoenix agenda called for nothing less than the complete dismantling of shareholder primacy, the doctrine that had driven corporate America for a century. In its place, she proposed a new metric, stakeholder justice, where companies would be legally evaluated not just on profits, but on pay equity, supplier diversity, and community impact. Capitalism isn't the problem, she declared, her voice echoing across the internet as live streams surged into the millions. Unaccountable power is. And today we're taking it back. The speech went supernova, but what happened next rewrote history. Within hours, California's pension fund, the largest in the U.S., announced it would divest from any company failing Amara's new audit standards. The NYSE and NASDAQ followed with plans to launch justice-adjusted stock indices. Even BlackRock, the world's most powerful asset manager, scrambled to rebrand its ESG funds under her framework. Yet the true earthquake came from an unexpected quarter. 27,000 Amazon warehouse workers walked off the job, demanding their employer adopt the Phoenix metrics, and they'd brought receipts. Leaked documents proved the company had known for years that injury rates spiked 300% in majority black facilities. The strike spread to ports, factories, and even Wall Street itself, where junior analysts leaked damning emails about racialized bonus disparities. The movement now had a name, Phoenix Rising, and its emblem, a stylized flame, appeared everywhere from protest signs to the lapels of progressive Congress members. Amara, meanwhile, was already 3 steps ahead. Her team quietly activated Operation Icarus, a network of activist investors prepared to simultaneously file shareholder resolutions at 50 Fortune 500 companies, demanding full Phoenix compliance. The play was as brilliant as it was ruthless. By weaponizing the very capitalist tools that had oppressed marginalized communities, she turned the system against itself. Banks that had redlined neighborhoods now faced depositor revolts. Tech giants found their own algorithms turned against them as #PhoenixAudit exposed bias in everything from hiring software to mortgage approvals. Then, at the movement's peak, came the ultimate validation. The White House invited her to draft an executive order mandating stakeholder justice metrics for all federal contractors. As Marine One touched down to whisk her to Washington, Amara allowed herself one fleeting thought looking at the presidential seal. They dragged me off a plane for wearing cream slacks. Now they're flying me to remake the economy. The irony wasn't lost on her, nor was the symbolism. Some fires didn't destroy. They purified.